funny, I was doing this. There we go. We're live.
Hi, I'm Beth Comstock. Thanks for joining. Sorry we're a few minutes late, but we're here. I'm happy to be with Joey Ito, head of the MIT Media Lab, and we are here to talk about Joey's book, Whiplash, for what we're calling our Changemakers Book Club. And Joey, we set this up because a lot of people want to figure out how to navigate change, how do they get ready for change, and there's nothing better than your book to talk about that, and no one better than you. I mean, I've known you over the years. It's been a privilege to know you and learn from you. You're an intersectional thinker, and I love what you've done here. So let's dig in.
Yeah.
So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So what was the genesis of Whiplash? How did you come up with this?
So I'd been trying to write a book for a long time. And when I joined the Media Lab as the director,
Which was 5 or 6 years ago?
It's 2011,
okay.
Yeah. My book agent, who's just very aggressive, John Brockman, he's a great book agent, he said, it's time. And we were in the process of having a bunch of faculty meetings to try to come up with the principles, and I was trying to see how my principles and the Media Lab's principles overlapped. And so our agent found a great co-author, Jeff Howe, who was a Wired journalist, who's great at telling stories and doing interviews and thinking thoughts like the ones that I had. And so we embarked on this journey that took, frankly, a lot longer than we expected.
Yeah.
But,
how long did it take you?
So we started in 2011, so it's about 5 years.
Yeah, well, hopefully that's not a message that takes you that long to grab the future, because I think you're arguing it's a fast future.
It is.
How did you come to name the book Whiplash? That is the best title ever.
Yeah, so it was kind of late because we were calling it something like The Principles, A Survival Guide to the Future, or something like that. And I was reading Joshua Ramo's book, Seventh Sense, and there was a section where he talked about technology and the whiplash that society was getting. And I said, that's what's going to happen, or is happening right now, and people are sort of feeling it.
But people are really feeling it. I mean, I know so many times you go places and we feel like we're in this sci-fi moment, but it's reality. So this idea of whiplash, you're basically saying the world's not going to go back. It's only going to get faster.
Yeah, I think that's right, and just a weird thing I'll say about whiplash, it's worse for you when you kind of tense up. You sort of want to go with it, and I think that's another thing is it's like a whiplashy moment, but there are better postures that you can have.
Okay, so don't tense up, don't be tense. That's one thing we'll take away. First of all, you lay out these principles as a way to organize the book. Talk about those a bit. They're very thoughtful.
Thank you. They were a product of conversations. Some of them are actually titles of other people's books, like Pull Over Push is based on a book by John C. Brown, John Hagel, and Lang Davidson called The Power of Pull. And so a lot of these come from other people's stories, and they all somewhat overlap and say similar things, but the idea is that they're also a little bit counterintuitive when you first hear them, so they spark a conversation. But we thought that if you organize, and this is sort of Jeff being a professional writer, that if you organize sort of chapters around principles and then put stories threaded inside, that it might be a readable book that still had sort of solid pillars or theories.
But you're asserting all these principles come together.
They do come together.
And it's really a system view that you've put together here. So one leads to the other.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, weirdly, I mean, the type of people we're trying to reach are people who need to understand these things, but if you don't look at them as a system, some people have kind of literally gone through and said, why 9, why 10, and in what order, but they all happen at the same time.
Yeah, I also feel like there's a real tension in how you did emergence over authority. I mean, one's going away and the other's emerging, but we're seeing them both happen at once. So if people want to put it in a neat box, they can't, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So you talk about 3 conditions that define our era. Give us a little bit of sense of those and why those.
3 conditions that define our era. Well, I don't remember exactly what the 3 conditions were.
Asymmetry, complexity, and uncertainty.
That's
and
right.
why were those 3 so strong to you?
So, and again, like the principles, they're related, right?
Yes.
So I think one of the things that technology has done is whether you're talking about the internet or manufacturing, it's significantly lowered the cost of communication, distribution, all these other things. So it inherently creates this asymmetry where the new players, and in GE obviously must be thinking about this a lot, where the new players have a distinct advantage. And so whether we're talking about warfare, whether we're talking about disruptive startups, there's a sort of asymmetry of power. And we're sitting here in Boston, and there was Annalise Sextanian's famous book called Regional Advantage about how the East Coast lost, the big computer companies sort of failed and lost to Silicon Valley. So that's, I think, a product of the diminishing cost of innovation in many fields. And complexity is just what happens when things go faster and things get connected. And as a result of the complexity, it sort of becomes obvious that you have a great deal of uncertainty. And the thing about uncertainty is that it's not like there have been moments in history where there's been turmoil and then it sort of gets better again. I think we're hypothesizing that it's becoming sort of a permanent state, and that it's the notion that things are knowable, at least in a linear sense, is sort of mostly gone. Yeah,
it's gone. So we have a lot of mindset shift we've got to get over as people. So we'd like you to. We are encouraging you to give us questions. Talk with one another. We asked for some questions in advance, and Joey, what we asked people to do was to bubble up your principles.
Okay.
And which one did they want you to especially talk about? And I was happy that they picked emergence over authority. So talk about emergence. You and I are kind of fans of this notion of emergence. It's a theory in science, but what does it mean to you, and why are you picking emergence over authority as something to think about?
So, and we have a mutual friend, Stephen Johnson, who wrote a great book
did this
called
with me last month.
Emergence. So many of the people watching probably saw that. But my favorite part is sort of where he describes the ants and how each individual ant doesn't understand the whole of it. But as a colony, they'll make sure that the graveyard is as far away from the food and as far away from the nest as possible. And so they can do basic geometry and all these other things. And what's interesting, and we always talk about the sum, is bigger than the parts. But with emergence, there's a kind of intelligence that gets created, and something that you can't really imagine being inside of that. And I think that whether we're talking about large companies or whether we're talking about social systems or whether we're talking about science, I think we're realizing that especially in the sort of complex self-adaptive systems, there's a kind of emergent collective intelligence is another thing that Tom Malone often talks about, that's occurring, and you can either embrace it or resist it. And I think for a lot of companies that are used to stocking knowledge and power in the center and pushing it to the edges, this idea of innovation on the edges, this idea of an emergent, and so even I would say Google's 20% time is a kind of belief in emergence, right?
Yeah.
Because it's sort of saying that ideas will happen and
how do you use this in your work here at the Media Lab? Are you modeled in an emergent way?
I think so. I think that's it was already like this when I got here, but we have 400 something projects, and none of them have asked permission. I'm kind of like a gardener. I can compost here, I can water plants there, I can move the lights around. Or maybe I'm like a disc jockey where I can change the music and I can fiddle with the environment, but basically everything that happens here happens because people are doing whatever they want to do.
So you use that word permission. You use it in your book quite a bit. I find this is one of the challenges in most established organizations is people feel they have to have permission to do something. But in an emergent organization, you do it because you think it's the right thing to do, or
right.
It's what you need to do. How do you think about permission? How do you set forth the folks at the Media Lab? Does permission have to be given, or do you expect people to grab it?
So I think if you go all the way back to the internet, the thing that made, and it's funny that we go all the way back now, the thing that made the internet great was that because of the simplicity of the protocols, so that any kid could learn how to figure out TCP/IP, people could build things without asking permission. So you'd have these protocols, and then you'd have an explosion of innovation by all these companies that just did stuff because you just had to build to these simple protocols. And I think that one of the biggest problems, so you can lower the cost of innovation, but if the cost of asking permission, the PowerPoints, the budgets, the meetings, exceeds the cost of trying it, then you've got this really weird problem where you've unleashed this ability to be super innovative, but you're holding it back by the cost of permission. And I still remember...
That's an interesting way to think about it. Holding it back by the cost of permission. I haven't heard of it that way. I like that.
And sometimes, I remember there was a company that was trying to decide whether to invest in one of my companies, and they spent more money on a feasibility study to decide not to invest than the
That
cost
you
of
put
the
that in the
investment.
book. Yeah.
And it's ridiculous.
I think it was something like that. They spent $2 million, but the study was going to be $600,000 or something like that, right?
And so I think, what you really want is a permissionless system where anybody can do anything they want without asking permission, but where the values and the culture of the system is such that whatever they build will be in sort of, the sensibility will be sort of consistent with what you have at the company.
I love that idea of cost of permission. So we're here doing the Changemakers Book Club. This is Whiplash. I'm with Joey Ito. So Joey, you've had this remarkable career. I'm actually at a loss for a word to describe your career. You are a venture capitalist, an activist, a designer, a teacher, an entrepreneur. I'm sure there's some things I haven't. How do you think of yourself, and how have you thought about building your path with all the different things you do?
So I had I guess I would call it a learning disability. I really wasn't able to focus on anything that I wasn't excited about. So I did very poorly in school. I got kicked out of kindergarten. I dropped out of.
You got kicked out of kindergarten?
I kept whenever the teacher wasn't looking, I'd run outside, and they finally told me not to come back. But I dropped out of college. But what I realized is I learned through doing, and I started doing all kinds of jobs. Like I worked in a pet shop. I worked in Hollywood. I worked as a disc jockey. I worked, wherever. And I learned a lot by talking to people and working, doing different things. And it took me a long time because I was trying to come up with a unified theory of the world. How does everything work, and how do all these things fit together? And mainly my value was contribution was connecting people in different disciplines together. It turns out that that's very valuable and useful, especially when you start seeing these silos. And right now, I think one of the problems that we have, whether we're talking about academia or corporations, is that whether you're talking about the funding or whether you're talking about the organizations, there's so much specialization and so much value locked up because of the silos that if you're able to translate between them, you can unlock the power. The thing is, you need to be able to speak the language, and you need to have the credibility and trust so that they take you serious enough to listen to you, right? Yeah. And so that takes a while to get.
Well, I think if you're this great intersectional thinker, you find a way to bring things together that maybe other people don't. You talk in the book about having almost a superpower of peripheral vision. And did you always appreciate that? I loved hearing that because I love the way you said it. I mean, to you, it's been the ability to focus, but really your state is looking out around you.
Yeah, well, and again, I think I'm using words to make my disability sound like superpowers. Because
well, it sounds like a super. I related to it. I believe I have that issue too. I love new ideas, and you're always looking for the patterns.
And you can't get lucky unless you identify the opportunities.
Yeah.
And you won't identify.
Say that again. I like that you said that.
You can't get lucky unless you identify the opportunities, and you'll always miss the opportunities if you're too focused.
Yeah.
Because focus is really on making sure that the expected results are achieved. And luck and serendipity is about trying to take advantage of those things that are unexpected. And there's a great New York Times article about how half of all inventions, at least in the survey that they did, were unexpected. And so if the person didn't have peripheral vision, they wouldn't have even noticed that it was invented.
Wow. Well, you're an entrepreneur, you're a venture capitalist. I mean, you talk about being focused. As an entrepreneur, you have to be super focused. How do you use that peripheral vision and advise yourself or the companies you're investing in to stay focused but look for opportunity?
So I think you need to train that muscle.
Yeah.
I think that's why my first 10 years of entrepreneurship all failed.
Yeah.
But I sucked, but I was trainable, and so that part, the focus part, I had to train.
But you argue that's what we all needed to navigate this world.
I think so, and I think everybody's different. So I think the trick is to figure out what are you. Make sure that you're doing whatever you're good at, but then train a few of those muscles that you need in order to be able to switch back and forth.
Or maybe get a team that can round
you
out.
That's a good point.
Somehow? I mean, do you do that at the Media Lab?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we had a question. Thanks for sending your questions. Keep them coming in. We'll keep going back and forth. Sandra Supel-Moria asked this question. She said, most experts agree it's neither genes nor environment that give people an edge. It's their mindset. And that's what we're talking about a bit here. And she asked if you can talk about whether you think adults can change their mind from fixed to growth, or is it genetic, I think is what she's asking.
So that's a hard one. I mean, that's the sort of nature and nurture question. And it's also the adults learning thing. I believe that people can always change. And
I do too.
Yeah, and I feel like some people You definitely have an initial setting. So my sister and I had very similar opportunities, but she went through school and got straight A's and was very structured. But now she's kind of entering this unstructured entrepreneurial phase.
Has she watched you?
She studied anthropology and education, and then looked over and saw me and started studying weird people like me. Whereas I went the other direction because I started in a very unstructured way, but now I'm operationally in charge of an institution, and so I think people can change, and I think also. But I think the most important thing is passion. So if you get passionate about something, you'll often learn things that you need in order to fulfill that passion.
So the passion kind of lets you clear things out of the way.
I think so.
So we had another question. This is from David Cutler, and it's around change and mindset. He says, "What's your suggestion? Like, what's the best way to deal with somebody who doesn't want to change? And how do you assess if somebody is open to change?" He asks, do they have to be willing and curious? Are they fearless enough to challenge the status quo? You talk about passion. And then he has this really interesting statement. He said, "Perhaps we need a change maker Yelp score."
Oh, interesting.
What do you think about that?
So I think it was in Good to Great, and there was a metaphor of before you drive the bus, you have to get all the right people on the bus and the wrong people off the bus, and get the people in the right seats. And I definitely feel that, where I don't have time to convert people who don't want to change to change.
So you just like that's too hard.
They should do what they want to do. I feel no ill will, but I want to make sure that the people that I'm with already have a predisposition, and I think in society also, like to take the educational system, I don't go after the educational system personally because it's a lot of work and it doesn't really want to change yet. And I feel like there are so many people and so many institutions that want to change that just going after them is a full-time job. And so that sort of sounds negative, but I think the trick is that if you can identify them because they'll be the people saying no to everything. And I think the key is to put teams together that are, and I think it's not, one thing I will say is you want some people who love infrastructure. You want some people who think very long-term. You want people who are extremely risk-averse because you need all these layers in society. So it's not like those people are bad. They just need to be in positions in the right role. And I think that if you're a change person, you need to surround yourself. You need some people who are accountants.
Yeah, I found you need people who say no sometimes. You need that critic on your team because otherwise maybe you'll sign up for a very naive path forward.
That's right. So that's the right seats part, right? So you don't want those people being forced to be change makers. I think that they just need to find the right position on the bus. Yeah.
So on this line, you talked in your book about sort of this idea of disobedience and the principle that you had, I'm just trying to remember, it was disobedience over compliance.
Yeah, my general counsel at MIT doesn't really like that one.
He doesn't like that one, but I think a lot of people gravitate to that because, again, in established organizations, the idea of being disobedient, it's hard for many people. So you quote Timothy Leary saying, quote, "Think for yourself and question authority." What have you've studied Timothy Leary, you know a lot about. I mean, what have you learned about disobedience in more organized structures that we can learn from you?
Yeah, so I think disobedience is different from disrespect. You don't have to be disrespectful. Disobedience literally is what Timothy said, which is to question authority and think for yourself. So whether you're you don't get a Nobel Prize by doing as you're told. And you don't discover new things by just memorizing what your professor said. What you do is you have to think, you have to question the status quo. And I think that's true in business. I think that's true in academia. And I think the key is that's how you start to think. And I think that so much of society, I think this had a lot to do with the Industrial Revolution, where you wanted soldiers and you wanted factory workers and you wanted white-collar workers to be relatively reliable, obedient, and fungible. And in that case, you want everybody to be sort of obedient. And I think today, with machine learning and with the creative work that we need to be focusing on, we need people to be thinking for themselves.
So how do you encourage the colleagues that you have here at MIT? How do you encourage them to be disobedient? I mean, you talk about MIT Media Lab as being sort of a hacker space already. You're kind of hacking education, hacking the university. How do you encourage your hackers to hack you and hack the system?
So a lot of it's just, I think it's culture is the main thing. I think that it's important to sincerely encourage it and love it. So Reid Hoffman, one of our advisory council members, is sponsoring a $250,000 disobedience prize that we're going to give in July for this is for socially impactful disobedience, and it will be one of the biggest prizes at MIT. So that's one way. I think that
I'm going to check out the criteria for
yes,
that.
I know.
That's interesting.
And this time, it could end up going to. I would be nominating the former Attorney General and the Department of Energy people who didn't want to give up climate negotiators' names. I think disobedience can happen in all kinds of places, and I think when you go back to the civil rights movement, Gandhi and Martin Luther King, they were all very disobedient, and I think there's a great I'll mangle it, but the Martin Luther King quote, which is you should follow just laws completely, but unjust laws you have to resist. And I think so whether you're talking about civil rights or science or even companies that are going down the wrong path, I think it's the duty of an employee or somebody to say, I don't think that's the right thing.
So I hear you're very ground in ethics as you make as you make your way forward in your disobedience. So again, we're Changemakers Book Club. Whiplash. I'm here with Joey Ito, and we're here at the fantastic MIT Media Lab. So we've got some more questions. If you're okay, I'm going to keep going to some questions. So this is from Emily Potter, and she says you began your book by relating what you know to furniture in a house and preconceptions and frameworks to beams and joists of the house. How do you challenge your own preconceptions? She's asking, how have you modified and changed what you think to be real or what you think to be given over time?
So I think that one of the tricks is to find joy in and delight in finding those things. So I actually teach a class called Awareness with a monk named Tenzin, and we just had a class this morning at 10 o'clock, and today's session was on self-awareness. And one of the great practices is, so I don't know if you've ever done unconscious bias training, where
we're about to do that in a couple weeks.
So it's really amazing, because even people who believe that they live by their values and they're not biased will find themselves saying and doing and thinking biased things. And you can either see these biases that go completely against the values that you believe in and say, oh my God, I'm a terrible person, or you can say, wow, that's so interesting. I didn't realize that I had this problem. And so for me, it's because I don't believe in real absolute reality, and I always love finding myself doing things that are peculiar or weird, and this sort of process of self-improvement is one of my favorite hobbies.
Yeah, mine too. I think that it's just, you wake up to I get out of bed to be better, just it's better, right?
Exactly, and I
but
think
it sounds like you're also looking at yourself somewhat with a bit of outside yourself and saying, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Aren't I interesting?
And that's
without judgment, maybe.
Yeah, it reminds me of, in Reid Hoffman's book, The Startup of You. You become your own project, and you're trying to constantly make yourself better, and you become a witness to the process, and then it becomes kind of like a project. And I think that we often talk about being kind to yourself. I mean, it's not about self-love, but what you want to do is you want to sort of look at yourself as your own child that you're trying to continue to improve. And I think that gets back to one of the earlier questions about, as an adult, how do you continue to have more fun and continue to improve? It's by continuing to treat yourself as a beginner and as a child.
When you were that kid running out of kindergarten and all the grade school, what did you think you wanted to be when you grew up?
So I did, I love certain things. I love science, but I'm not really a planner type. I'm just sort of happy where I am. Yeah.
So a couple of questions are asking, how do you unplug? How do you turn off? Do you? I mean, if you're such a pattern seeker and you're always looking for the new, you love that.
So I'm meditating every morning. So
Have you always done that?
I go on and off. Right now, especially during this class that I'm teaching, where I'm forcing all my students to meditate every morning, I make sure I do that practice. Scuba diving, when I find I'm sort of down in the water, staring at underwater wildlife, I'm sort of in the moment. So things where, like nature and other things that just sort of draw me into presence, those things really help me reset my brain.
I read something recently, I think it's a Japanese this idea that you bathe yourself in nature, this idea of going out and just bathing yourself, and that there may also be some biological things that you're doing, but this idea of just having a nature bath, I thought was so lovely. Absolutely.
And if you do that, what's neat is when you meditate, you can kind of go back to that place. Yeah.
So we have some other questions. I'm going to shift gears. So someone was asking just how do you, well, I was talking about unplugging. Let's go back to the world we're living in now, fake news, just news sources from everywhere. Antoinette Martin asks, have we adequately assessed the human capacity to absorb and use media effectively? At what point does the volume and the pace start to detract rather than accelerate, whether it's personal life or business? I think we're all struggling with that. What are your thoughts?
So I think about it sort of in an evolutionary dynamic, because I think that our children are consuming the news very differently. I'm on the board of the New York Times, so I know for a fact that they consume it differently. And then the technology evolves. So for instance, remember when we had terrible spam problems and we thought we'd have to shut down the internet? Well, the technology evolved filters to deal with spam. And then the institutions are also evolving. So I think what we're seeing right now, just as we've seen with spam, just as we've seen with bad search results, there's sort of moments in history where things just aren't working, and we have the traditional journalism slightly on the ropes from a business perspective and sort of a trust perspective. So I think it's a tough time, but I think that we'll evolve through it. I think that we have to work and we have to be diligent. We have to think about it, and it is a problem. But I'm not concerned that this is going to be a long-term problem. But I'm also perfectly sure that it's not going to look at all like what we thought it was. So I think it's going to look like something we can't really imagine exactly.
So you talk about life, BI and PI, before internet and post-internet.
Yeah.
And for some group of people, they're only going to know life PI, post-internet. How is it helpful for you to think about the world that way? So
I think, first of all, your brains as kids who are born post-internet are completely different.
And how is that?
So for example, the idea that you're always connected, that you always have Wikipedia, that your phone as a prosthesis has all of your friends and all of the knowledge of the world, and the ability to learn just about anything there. Now, compare that to, just remember when we used to hang around in bars and argue all night about the population of Costa Rica? Well, that doesn't happen anymore.
I'm not sure I ever did that.
But the problem is, it's a muscle that you get. And I think one of the problems, by the way, if I were to criticize the educational system, we're creating children as if they're going to end up on the top of a mountain with no phone and no friends and a number 2 pencil. That's like such an edge case that would never happen. And we should be training our children and teaching our children not only to be super creative, but turning them into these robots that assume the internet doesn't exist. And so I think that right now, the informal learning that happens outside of school is primarily where kids are learning this sort of intuitive understanding of how to use the net, whether it's to learn or for collective action. But also, I think we need to figure out how this educational system adapts. And I said I wasn't going to attack it because it's a huge job.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about learning over education as one of the tensions. You didn't call it out as a principle, but it permeates the book. How is that? What does that mean, learning versus education? Isn't that the same thing?
Yeah, so for me, I'm biased again because I wasn't very good at education. And to me, education was something that people were trying to do to me, and learning was what I was doing to myself. And I think that education really is a system. And learning to learn, once you learn to learn, right now, again, not everybody has internet, but if you have access to the internet, you can learn just about anything if you include the fact that you can email somebody and go and see them. And so I think the importance of focus on learning, and also I think education tends to be somewhat standardized as an image, but I think what we want, especially in the age of machines, is you want everybody to be different. And in order for everybody to be different, I think you want everybody to have a variety of passions and an ability to learn.
So we're talking about Whiplash with Joey Ito here on the Changemakers Book Club. Let's talk about minds and machines. I think that you're certainly leading the charge and thinking about that. It comes up in your book, a lot of the questions that people are asking. So let me just dig in. Martin Brandt asks, how close are we to developing a machine that has a mind, consciousness, and a mental state?
So it's a good question. And I have a lot of very smart people who are very sort of divided across the spectrum on when and how that works. Will happen. I think that there are a number of breakthroughs that need to happen before we're even close to that. I think that it is possible that we will have a conscious machine and so on and so forth. But I think it's much more likely to be what we at the Media Lab called extended intelligence. So right now, for instance, GE is probably much smarter than the sum of its parts. It probably, none of you know how the whole thing works.
Yeah.
And somehow it's able to do all kinds of things because it's a kind of collective intelligence. And in the system, you've got computers, you've got, people use Google, people use all kinds of things. So the system is also augmented already by machines. And I think what's going to happen is artificial intelligence won't be some monolithic oracle, but it'll be all kinds of systems that get built into our network that augment us as individuals, but augment us as a system. And the way that you think about companies being super smart entities that do all kinds of things, I think is going to be the way we see machine intelligence manifest, not as a separately conscious system, but as something that's part of our societal consciousness. Now, having said that, I think it's kind of like, to use another metaphor, it's kind of like we have this alien baby that's growing up.
Is it cute?
And we don't know yet.
Okay.
And it's learning to walk, it's learning to do things. We don't know exactly what it's going to learn to do next. And we've got scientists working on.
Some people think it's like a scary monster that's like got 20 eyes or something.
Yeah.
You make it sound so sweet.
Well, Pedro Domingos, in his book, The Master Algorithm, said it in a great way. He said, he's not afraid of a super intelligence coming and destroying the world. He's afraid of stupid intelligence that's already taken over the world. And I think that's closer to my fear.
Arnaban Konar asks, adding on the artificial intelligence, can you imagine that tech can help us augment our creativity? And let's talk about creativity. You have some really great examples in the book. Is that a way we should be thinking about artificial intelligence and augmented technology?
So I think machines will augment us in a variety of ways, and I think augmenting our creativity will be a great piece. The really interesting question is how creative machines themselves can be. There are machine-generated music. AlphaGo's move was viewed by many as a creative move, the one that beat Lee Sedol, and so yes, I think it's going to be a tremendously valuable thing. And also, one other thing is augmenting creativity can mean a lot of things, but I think it will release us from a lot of non-creative things to spend energy on creative things.
Spend time on developing our creativity, perhaps, is
that's
one
right.
of the byproducts?
Because if you think about even a chess grandmaster, half their brain is just doing calculations. If those calculations could be done by a machine, maybe even plugged into your brain, the rest you could use your whole brain on focusing on the emotional, on the creative part of the game.
I believe everyone is creative, but not everyone feels comfortable. Do you believe everyone is creative?
I think everyone is creative. I love the book by the Kelly brothers called Creative Confidence, and I think that in that book they argue that creativity is sort of beaten out of you as you grow up. And I often do this poll and ask, how many people felt creative when they were 5 years old, and most people did. They painted and stuff, and then most people don't feel creative. And I think our educational system really does pound it out of you. Yeah.
So you're a big thinker in terms of artificial intelligence and morality. One of the questions that was asked here from Nan Kun Lee asks, morality and future of AI will clash. How can we ensure humans stay relevant in the near future? And are we advancing, or are we just creating the beginning of the end? So talk about how you're taking on ethics and I don't know if you'd call it morality, but certainly ethics and artificial intelligence here, and how you're thinking about it.
So absolutely, morality has a huge role. I think one of the problems with artificial intelligence right now is that the number of people who can actively contribute to the field technically are small in number, and they tend to work in large tech companies. And it's still hard enough so that the typical ethicist or sociologist can't really understand machine learning well enough to be able to get into the sort of creation of those machines. And so what we're trying to do at the Media Lab, and we've created a fund to try to fund this work, is to try to make machine learning more understandable to non-computer scientists, and also to try to get the computer scientists to understand and listen to the other fields. Because I think one of the problems that some computer scientists face, and there's sort of this group of people who believe in singularity, and this Ray Kurzweil notion that we're getting to sort of geometric growth, and at some point soon we're going to get computers that are so smart that all this messy stuff like morality and ethics and society will become irrelevant. And the dystopian view is that humans become irrelevant. The optimistic view is that we transcend our bodies and we become this super consciousness.
We live forever.
We live forever. But I think that's misguided. I think that there is a lot of stuff in ethics and morality that needs to be built into the machines in order, even if it's a society of machines, they're going to have a way for that society to be resilient, for that society to be vibrant, for that society to have meaning. And I think that you can't computer science your way through that. I think that there's a tremendous amount of knowledge out there. And also, there are natural systems, there are biological systems that have a tremendous amount of information and value that we need to be interfacing with. And so I think that a lot of this at the academic level is bringing these disciplines together. I think at the business level, I think it's companies, and I think G is a great example because you've got machine learning capability inside of a company that does all this other stuff. I think that my fear is where you have companies that don't have any understanding of machine learning, and then you have companies that are doing just machine learning.
Well, after talking to you several times, I've been thinking a lot about just the return of ethicists in corporations, us needing to think through the unintended consequences. I didn't study philosophy at all in school, but I'm reading it like crazy now. I want ancient wisdom. I mean, so we're not going to go away from those things. If anything, I think we're going to be examining them more, perhaps. So a couple of questions as we wrap up here. A couple of thoughts. So there was a whole train of thought. Carrie, I'm not good at pronouncing names, but Carrie Montemidi, I think I'm pronouncing Carrie's name right. Asked she says, what are the key areas where companies should actually slow down and be more thoughtful? And ethics and morality might be one, but what are your thoughts on that? We're talking about speed, but yet, how do we? Sometimes you have to go slow to go fast.
Yeah, I think the key word in that sentence is be more thoughtful, right? So I think that anyone who's making anything should think about every system that it connects to. So usually if you're creating some sort of widget, you think about the place that widget fits into, whether it's a product or an ecosystem. But everything that you do affects a whole bunch of different systems, whether it's the ethical system or the educational system. And I think that everyone, whether you're a product designer or a scientist, needs to be responsible for, if not in control of, what's happening in those systems. So that's both an awareness and a thoughtfulness. And the slowing down part, I think, is important in a different way, which is whether you're talking about agile software development or the development of a policy or any evolutionary system, you want a feedback system. And so you want to be iterating, you want to be aware. And I think you can't just sort of release and scale. You have to iterate and move. And so it may ultimately be slower, but it's going to be a lot more thoughtful and a lot more appropriate if you do things in an iterative way. And I think in the old mass production world, you didn't have the opportunity to be iterative because you just had to go with the product.
And you talk about iteration as also a way to navigate risk. You're not going to have a risk-free equation. In fact, you say risk over safety. And is that one of the ways you see risk unfolding?
Yeah, I think what you're doing is by making the chunks smaller and the cost of risk lower, you can take more risk at less cost. And so where before you'd spend all this money trying to prevent anything bad from happening, here what you do is you just say, okay, well, let's assume it's going to fail. What am I going to learn from it? And based on, if it fails, I've learned I'm going to go this way. If it's successful, I'll go this way. And I think if you think of, again, I think it's kind of fashionable to say fail fast and failure is good. But if you think
no one really likes to fail.
No one likes to fail.
I've asked people everywhere I go, do you like to fail? No one will sign up for that.
And I think the key is to extract something that you can learn, so that even though it might have sucked, you're walking away with something that you can use.
So we're talking about Joey Ito's book, Whiplash. We'll wrap up with just a few last questions. I thought this one was really good, from Shonda Lynn Zilich. She said earlier you talked about driving toward your passions, and you're very passionate about being passionate. Any suggestions on helping people discover their passions? She said, she's trying to match her job passions to what's available to her, and she feels like she's falling short. How do you do it?
Well, first of all, like creativity. I think it's something that if you're more likely to have when you're a child, and as a parent, I think it's really important to try to not destroy that in your child and let your child chase crazy passions. I think as an adult, some people will find their hobby turn into their real job, and I think that regardless of what age you do it. My mother was a housewife until she was 35. Then she became a professional. She became a CEO, and she moved careers. And so she was a role model for being able to change her and always following her passion. So I don't think it's ever too late. But I do think that that people and companies and other people who try to, because I think that a lot of the things that we think of as hobbies. Sorry, I'm going to jump around, but one last thing I'll say is I think that one of the problems is we measure success and value financially. And I think one of the problems is that some of the most important things that we do, like parenting, are not calculated as productive things. They don't get calculated into GDP, and you work so that you can put your child in daycare. But maybe if you can afford it, you should put your time into your child. And so the other key thing, I think, is that your passion doesn't necessarily need to start out as a vocational thing. But often, if you get really geeked out into it, it will become that.
I find in companies sometimes you just need to ask. Maybe the people you work for didn't think that was was something, and it was just there for you to find it and discover it and suggest a path forward. So I've often found going where frankly no one else wants to take on something is sometimes a way to bring your passion to that and make something of it.
And maybe you're feeling a little disobedient.
Yeah, maybe you feel disobedient. Maybe that is exactly it. So I'm trying. Anil Yangun asks, what's the next big thing? What are you looking at? I mean, there's so much you talked about in your book. I think that would keep us busy for hours. But what do you focus on as the kind of next big thing?
So I think I mentioned it in the book, but I think what's coming out, even in our lab, is the real shift in life sciences and its effect on the environments through things like CRISPR gene drive.
And explain what CRISPR gene drive.
So CRISPR was a cheap way to edit genes, and then CRISPR gene drive was a way to make an edit in a species, let's say a mosquito, so that it can't carry Zika. And then gene drive is that you release that into the wild, and all the offspring will inherit that modification. And we have a project where Kevin Esfelt from our lab and his team are going to Nantucket with this idea of creating a mouse, which is a carrier for Lyme's disease, that can't carry Lyme's disease, and releasing it into the wild, and doing these town hall meetings. And what's really interesting and important about that is that we want it to be a community-driven thing rather than something that outsiders would come in and do for them. But I think you add to that AI and machine learning, and then you realize that the way that science progresses changes fundamentally. And then we talk about cryptocurrency a little bit, but you add AI and cryptocurrency, and that changes everything. And then you have the future of warfare. And so all of these things start to mix together and feed off of each other. And so if you can imagine autonomous corporations that can that have the ability to do scientific research, that have digital currency, that do things. I mean, so again, it gets a little bit science fictiony, and this is why we're inviting a lot of science fiction writers now to participate at the Media Lab.
I was going to ask you how much science fiction you read and what inspires you from that perspective.
Yeah. So
movies, books. What are some recommendations you make?
Well, I feel like lately we've kind of caught up to and passed science fiction.
So it's over for science fiction writers?
No, so what we're doing is now we're collaborating with science fiction writers, because science fiction writers have a very good way of sort of taking something and putting it on, turning it on its head. It's a very funny moment when J.J. Abrams was touring the lab, and they said, "Oh, do you make things that like kill people?" We said, "No, we don't do that kind of stuff. We only do things for good." And he said, "Okay, wait, let me rephrase that. Can you imagine anything in the lab being used by an evil character to destroy the world?" And everybody's like, "Yeah." And what's interesting, but science fiction writers help you ask questions you wouldn't normally ask yourself. And in fact, from an ethics perspective, that's important. If the thing that you're creating to be educational could actually be used to kill people, but you hadn't thought about it until JJ asked you, you ought to be thinking about it. And so sort of on a serious note, the fact that JJ would come and ask that question, then make a movie about it, helps us reflect on our technology. So I think science fiction is becoming a little less about, here's this crazy future, to here's how you ought to be reflecting on the technologies that you're creating.
So asking questions, how do you encourage your folks to ask questions differently? Do you bring different people in, like more like J.J. Abrams hanging around asking questions all the time?
Yeah, absolutely. So that.
I mean, that seems like a good practice
Well,
for everybody.
you're on our advisory
I'm
council.
looking
That's part of
forward to it,
that's
yeah.
part of your job. And then we have a thing called the Directors Fellows, that include Native American playwrights and Shaka Senghor, who spent 19 years in prison, and they come and they interact with the lab, and they help us think very differently.
So I'd love to just summarize the book. Again, we've been talking about Whiplash with Joey Ito. I mean, I have a couple of quotes here, and I'd love you to summarize it. You say, in the past 25 years, we've moved from a world dominated by simple systems to a world beset and baffled by complex systems. Yet you're very optimistic, and you basically make the case that we're in the midst of fundamental change, yet humanity and people are so adaptable. How do we keep being adaptable?
Well, I think we're inherently adaptable. And I think, 30-some years ago, Time magazine had a cover story about the test tube baby and the horror, And now it's covered by IVF, and it makes people happy, all day long. And so I think a lot of things that we're afraid of now will turn out actually to be good. Some things will be bad. But I think we're fun. So there's an interesting study on pain. Pain is always scarier in anticipation of pain.
That's true.
But when you're
I
actually
remember once crying like crazy because I didn't want to get a shot when I was like 7. But the
once
shot wasn't so bad.
Right, or the ripping the Band-Aid off. So I feel like a lot of our fear is the anticipation of all these things. But as they start to happen, I think that we'll start to. They won't be nearly as
Doesn't our
painful.
media world, where so many inputs, in some ways, couldn't we argue that's making our anxiety more?
Absolutely, and I think the role of journalism is to take power and put it in check. And so almost by definition, their job is to write negative stuff. And so I think one of the things that we should start seeing more of, hopefully evolve, is how do we tell good stories? How do we tell thoughtful stories? And I think, and again, there's a much longer conversation about media and information, but I think that the general optimism with the critical eye is going to be the important stance for people in industry, people in academia, and what's the right kind of media to give people both of those.
So I take away from this an optimistic view of the future. Creativity and humanity will win if we really invest in what that means. You had this, just to close, you had this great line. You said, the principles of your book that you lay out, we're going to help you be more flexible and learn the new roles. And over time, we'll discard those when they don't work anymore. So sort of sum it up for us. How should we think about the principles in Whiplash? How should we use them?
So I think everybody is in a different place on the spectrum, and in a slightly different place. So first of all, I don't think that the principles will apply to everyone. But I think they should provoke you to think about your condition and be sort of witness to what's going on in your life and in your environment. And I think that people should come up with their own principles, and I think that, and again, the principles, not rules. And I think it's important, as you said at the beginning, to think of them as a system in a way to force you to think about what's going on in a different way. And again, it's like the compasses over maps. They're general trajectories and trends. They're not predictions. And so I think what you really want to do is to come up with your own trajectory and an ability to, because I think the problem is, in the past you used to learn, and then you would do the same thing for the rest of your life in production mode. That no longer works. And I think the key is that if you can get yourself into a mode where you're